Hi. So I want to ask the question of how social constructionism is connected to anti-realism. So it's widely reported that there's some connection. For instance, hacking says that constructionism joins hands very naturally with irrealism. Haslinger says that social construction has come to be associated with a broad anti-realism. Malin likewise records a reported connection. And Asya Pazinski begins a 2020 article speaking of, quote, a widespread sentiment to the effect that social entities such as nation states, political borders, and pieces of money are just figments of our collective imagination and not really out there in the world. She cites examples such as a New Yorker cartoon saying, sure, money may be imaginary, but at least it's got everybody imagining it. So it seems to be widely thought that social construction entails anti-realism, but that said, none of the authors I just cited actually endorse the entailment claim. Rather, they all put the claim forward as being kind of out there in the zeitgeist, or maybe like popular in like those hip circles where people read Foucault, or in certain alluring corners of the internet, or somewhere. I don't actually know any current analytic philosophers who directly endorse the entailment thesis. Rather, what we see is a literature running from people like John Searle, Charles Mills, through to people like Elizabeth Barnes and Rebecca Mason, in which basically everyone says that there's this like looming idea of anti-realism, but that social constructionism can fit with a purely realist framework. So it's unclear who thinks that social constructionism entails anti-realism, or why such a person might think so, or why that claim might be popular in certain circles if it is so. Of course, it's also unclear what exactly social construction means, and further unclear what exactly realism and anti-realism exactly mean. Crispin Wright dryly comments that a philosopher who asserts that she is a realist has probably, for most philosophical audiences, accomplished little more than clear her throat. So the question about whether social constructionism entails anti-realism is off to a pretty terrible start on 3 separate counts. We don't know who holds the view or why. We don't know what social construction means. And we don't know what realism and anti-realism mean. I guess we could also worry about what entails means, but things are already bad enough. So I think there's something interesting here in this debate, and I want to try to extract it. And I want to do so by trying to take a step back from the existing literature and try to understand sort of the guiding intuitions behind the thought that social constructionism might take us somewhere in the vicinity of anti-realism. And having, once I have unearthed or try to claim to unearth the guiding intuitions, then I'll try to sketch a positive view, a social relationalist view on which core social statuses are relations to social rules, and claim that that view can fit the guiding intuitions. So I'm not going to claim that social construction is realist or anti-realist, because really what do those terms mean anyway? Rather, I'm going to claim that social relationalism satisfies the guiding intuitions in the vicinity. In other words, social relationalism captures what lies beneath the thought that social construction entails anti-realism. I'm also going to claim that social relationalism exhibits a very general pattern of kind of what you broadly might think of as like realist triumph. We'll see how that goes. So first, I want to try to unearth, to the extent that I can, the guiding intuitions here. Why is there some thought that there's some path from social construction to anything in the vicinity of anti-realism? My sense is that there are at least 4 main interconnected ideas. First idea, I'll call this enactment, and it's a kind of mind dependence idea. Okay? So this is the thought that socially constructed phenomena are not pre-existing natural phenomena independent of our minds, but rather they are brought about via the social depths. For instance, given that gender is a social construction, which I'll assume for the purposes of this talk, the idea here is that we don't come to the social world with pre-existing natural genders, which a given society might then sort correctly or incorrectly, but rather the very sorting constitutes the gender that we have. Our genders are brought into being or made, or as I'll say, enacted by what's going on in society. It's people's behaviors and attitudes, as well as the material environment in which we're embedded, that determine the gender classification scheme. So this is a kind of mind dependence. In this vein, Asta invokes the Euthyphro contrast as to whether something is pious because beloved by the gods or beloved by the gods because pious. And she speaks about the metaphysical status of the various properties that clothe our world as mirroring this question exactly. And she puts forward her conferralist proposal as a way of making sense of the idea that social properties are had because of the sort of mind-dependent stuff about people's behaviors and attitudes. Likewise, Barnes, to convey the sense in which Hasliger's view is realist, compares core social statuses to wheel ruts, made from like the carriage wheels repeatedly passing over the earth, caused by repeated patterns of travel. That's a lovely metaphor, although core social, that's really a causal metaphor. We want to think of the core social statuses as not caused by, but metaphysically constituted by the repeated social pattern. So I'm going to switch, I like the wheel ruts metaphor well enough, I'm going to switch it to something a little more constitutive and think of core social statuses as kind of the figures and formations that emerge from a dance. So if we all like dance in a certain way, it may be that our dance comes to sort of form a line or a wave or some other broader and interesting configuration. And the fact that our dance forms a wave is going to be constituted by the behaviors of us dancers, as well as the stage on which we dance. So this idea of enactment as a very particular sort of mind dependence carries with it the thought that the core social statuses are just, well, mind-dependent reflections of some underlying activities. And in that sense, I think you can see how a broadly anti-realist thought can be inspired. And there's a useful contrast that I'm gonna keep appealing to, which is that on the one hand, we have things like rocks that are just out there independently of us. They just have like things like the masses that they have, regardless of how society dances. Whereas the core social statuses are more like the figures we form in our dance. Second thought, I'll call this variability. It's the thought that socially constructed phenomena are not fixed across space and time or possibilities, but rather are historically variable matters. For instance, given that race is a social construction, also something I'll just be assuming for the purposes of this talk, the idea here is that there is not one race classification scheme, but many, such that historians and anthropologists may find many such schemes as they look across places and times. So in this vein, the sociologists Omi and Winant, discussing the social construction of race, say that to say that race is socially constructed is to argue that it varies according to time and place, and they go on to catalog the fluidity of race concepts across time within the US context, but also like between the US and Brazil, Japan, South Africa. So there's this idea of categorization not being fixed, but being highly variable. In this sense, socially constructed categorizations seem changeable, they seem subjective. Variability adds to enactment the previous idea, the further thought that not only are the core social statuses kind of these figures that we form in our dance, but also that we can dance differently. People have danced differently in other times and places and thereby enacted different forms, and we can dance differently in the future if we are wise enough to do so. It doesn't need to be this way. Third thought. Extrinsicness. On social constructionist views, core social statuses are not intrinsic features of things or persons, but rather extrinsic, in being at least partly constituted by the wider social milieu, including both the behavior of others and the material environment. Thus, McKittrick defends a dispositionalist view of gender as involving extrinsic dispositions such that one's gender will be relative to context and consequently extrinsic. To shift examples, an atom for atom duplicate of a given piece of paper could count as money in one milieu, but not in another. And so, given the Lewisian conception of intrinsic properties as those that never divide duplicates, core social statuses will count as extrinsic. A duplicate piece of paper in a different environment will differ over its monetary status. And you can see how this is also connected to the kind of realist, anti-realist dispute. Hacking here speaks of the broadly realist idea, which he labels inherent structuralism, that, quote, the world comes with an inherent structure, which it is the scientist's task to discover. And Kit Fine, who's not focused on social ontology, but on a general way of thinking about realism and anti-realism, invokes in that discussion a primitive notion of reality, capital R, which he describes as the conception of reality as it is in itself. And he speaks of this positive idea of the intrinsic structure of reality. So here, with extrinsicness, we see a further departure from the kind of realist image of a rock with a certain independent, fixed, and intrinsic mass. Final point, normativity. Core social statuses are not merely factual matters, but normatively loaded. For instance, being a man comes with certain normative constraints and enablements. It dictates, or at least has at certain points in time, certain milieu, dictated personal matters, core personal matters like what clothes one may wear, what jobs one may hold, whom one may marry. As Asta has noted, it is a guiding constraint that, quote, a metaphysics of social construction should explain these normative implications. And in Haslinger's view, it's part of the very essence of being a man, that it comes with a certain privileged social status. And on Dembroff's view of patriarchy, patriarchy just is the dynamic process of enforcing manhood and womanhood ideals by which real men gain dominance. Of course, it's also part of a broadly realist picture that the domain in question has a factual status. And so this idea of value-ladenness may feel like a departure from at least a paradigmatic realist image. So putting this all together, perhaps the best way to capture what lies beneath the thought that social construction entails anti-realism is to think of the following points of contrast. On the one hand, we have a rock with a given mass. The rock has that mass in a mind-independent, fixed, intrinsic, and purely factual way. On the other hand, we have, say, a person with a gender. And that person, on a social constructionist view, has that gender in a mind-dependent, variable, extrinsic, and value-laden way. So whatever exactly we mean by realism and anti-realism, there's a core contrast here between the mass of a rock and the gender of a person, which we should capture if we can. Now I want to turn to the idea of social relationalism and the attempt to capture the intuition. So I'll sketch the social relationalist view, say how it captures the intuition. I won't consider other views, no time. I won't claim that social relationalism is the only way or even the best way to capture the contrasted issue, just saying that it is a way to do so. So let me first tell you what social relationalism is. It's the view which emerged out of an ongoing debate I have with Brian Epstein, and it's being worked out in detail in joint work I have ongoing with Robin Dembroff. And the basic idea here is that core social statuses, I'll continue to work with money, gender, and race as my worked examples, they should not be understood in terms of simple binary properties like being $20 or being a man or being Black. Rather, they should be understood as ternary relations with an argument place for social rule or social grids. So instead of like being money, being Black, being a man, the social relationalist will replace these with relations such as being monetized as $20 by the current US rules, or being racialized as Black by the one drop rule, which was a sorting rule that was dominant in the Jim Crow era US South that said if you have a drop of African blood, you count as Black. And then there's, for instance, being gendered as a man by the original birth certificate rule. That says that if on your original birth certificate you were marked as a man and that wasn't an error at the time, you're thereby a man regardless of what transitions and transformations you may have enjoyed. A given piece of paper may be monetized by one rule and not another. Likewise, a person may be gendered as a man by the original birth certificate rule, which I think is also a very oppressive, morally outrageous rule, but not gendered as a man, and indeed gendered as a woman by more liberatory rules, such as those that allow sincere and ongoing self-identification to be at least partly constitutive of one's gender. So for the social relationalist, talk of something being money or of someone being white or a woman is either just simply false or at best a context-dependent shorthand for a salient relational status. Two further points about these rules will be relevant. First, these rules have both membership conditions and they have normative or kind of output conditions. So a grid imposes a mapping from things into social positions. It's like a sorting hat. You put it on and it sorts you into various social boxes. It determines who counts for what. A grid then assigns norms to the that are associated with these social positions. So by determining that a person has a given gender, it assigns them a certain ideal, being a real man or a real woman, that guides normative constraints and enablements. Real men don't get to cry, but they do get to run the world. Second relevant point, these grids may or may not be imposed to a given degree in a given social milieu. It's sometimes said that our US race grid simply does not exist or arise in Brazil. Perhaps it didn't exist in the Middle Ages, but we can now look over at Brazil or back at the Middle Ages from the US perspective and classify people. This is what anthropologists call an etic use of concepts, and fits Brian Epstein's notion of social concepts as a universal tool that we can export across space and time and possibilities, even where they're not being imposed. So we can distinguish for a given subject those social relations imposed on her in her life and from those that are merely, so to speak, on the outside looking in. So I won't try to explain social relationalism in greater detail here. Please ask me for more details in Q&A. I hope this sketch is clear enough to work with. I want to conclude by briefly showing how this view can capture those core intuitions. So the first one was enactment, this kind of particular understanding of mind dependence on which the core social statuses are enacted like figures in a dance. So starting with that idea, the idea is that the rules that are imposed on us via the social dance. It's how things go, our behaviors, our attitudes, and the material environment that dictate which relations are imposed on us in the course of our life. So that social relationalist has a way of saying that the fact that this particular social relation is causally active in the course of one's life is due to the social dance. Variability, again, which social relations are imposed on us will vary. For instance, our understandings of race will vary across space. So in the US, current US versus current Brazil, there are different rules of race that are imposed upon people, and thus the variability of race. Extrinsicness, these core social statuses are not intrinsic features of things or persons, but rather they are extrinsic because relational to these outside social rules. And normativity, as relations to social rules, these rules assign normative statuses, and thus we get in the metaphysics a link to the normative. I'm running out of time. That was a bit fast, sorry. I want to conclude with one last thought, which is the idea that social relationalism is itself a realist view, because it is a mind-independent matter, an objective matter, that a given person stands in these relations to various social rules. And in that way, social relationalism embodies a certain very general kind of what I think of as a kind of triumph of realism. For any phenomena whatsoever that's mind dependent, and so in that sense, sort of apt for some kind of anti-realist treatment, there is an objective relation of dependence holding between our minds and the phenomena in question, in virtue of which the phenomena counts as mind dependent. You can think of the social relationalist as putting forward the objectified relation between things and the social rules, the mind-dependent aspect of things, as being the core social statuses. And so making sense of the mind dependence of core social statuses through these real and objective relations. So I conclude that there is something intuitive behind the hard to grasp idea that social construction entails anti-realism, that this idea may be captured by social relationalism, and in a way that in turn exhibits a very general kind of realist triumph. So thank you very much. I look forward to questions.